Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Before School podcast. Today we have an amazing guest, Professor David Kipping. He's a professor at Columbia University. He's an astronomer, he's an astrophysicist, and he's the host of the Cool Worlds YouTube channel, which is absolutely amazing. I hope you all check it out. But before this podcast begins, I wanted to share some cool news. We got some great shirts available with the after school art on it. So if you like the after school art and you want to support this channel, please check out these shirts and I hope you love them. Without further ado, let's dive into the podcast. Hello, David Kipping. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Mark. This is a real pleasure to be here.
This is a real honor. I've been wanting to get you on here for a while.
Hey, likewise. Yeah, a big fan of all your content on YouTube as well. So it's great to be on here at last.
Thank you. I absolutely love your YouTube channel. I think it's just the perfect marriage of education and entertainment. And I think it's the best YouTube channel out there.
Well, that's high praise because there's so many great channels on YouTube, and it's hard because for me this isn't even my full-time job. This is just something I do in between my work as a professor, which means I'm teaching classes, I'm leading a research group, reviewing papers, all the work that comes as being an academic. And so I always feel bad because people often comment like, make more videos, please make more. And that's great. I guess it's always good to leave people wanting more, but it does make me feel like I have a lot more I could make, and I just unfortunately don't have the time. So I appreciate that people are patient enough to stick with me despite the slow schedule sometimes.
I think that makes the videos even more special because you have this background.
Yeah. I mean, when I started the channel, that was one of my goals, was to try and bring a sense of authenticity. There are so many wonderful science communicators on YouTube, but there weren't too many who had their feet actively in the world of research. And I felt there was something unique there to offer, that people probably didn't have an insight as to how an active working scientist really thinks about new discoveries, news results coming out, how to be skeptical about things, and how we interpret new information on the fly. And so I really wanted to bring that sense of experience as a researcher to the world of science communication. It's not to say that we don't need science communicators who are not researchers, because I think they do bring something completely different and fresh and wonderful. But I do advocate that if you are a researcher and you're interested in science communication, I think you have something valuable and unique to offer to the science communication world.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that probably is one of the biggest problems with academia right now is just the communication. They spend so many millions of dollars on the research side, and then it gets published in some little journal and maybe 1,000 people read it. Where on the other hand, you have a teenager with TikTok who is in their kitchen and they do a little dance move and they get 10 million views.
Yeah, I get it. It's your attention span has to be far less for the latter than the former, though. So it's always an uphill battle to try and get someone to invest. You can't explain these ideas in 1 minute, 30 seconds. You need more time than that. My videos are typically at least sort of 15, 20 minutes in length, sometimes half an hour or so. And you do need time to explore complex topics and justify the arguments and assumptions and conclusions and get into all of that. And I think there is a challenge that we are rising to, but we're always going to have one hand tied behind our back. At the same time, I don't think we don't need to have the billions of views of someone doing a TikTok dance. I'm kind of happy if we just get if we get 1 million views in one of my videos, that's really amazing. And if you imagine giving a public lecture in an auditorium and you had even 1,000 people there, you'd be overwhelmed with the amazing opportunity you had to teach people. And so to have the views we get in our YouTube videos is I'm very happy with it. Obviously, it's nice to get more and more. And I think YouTube kind of promotes this mentality of like you have to keep building and building and building. And I think it can actually make you very anxious. There's so many YouTubers, I'm sure you've probably felt this way at times, of burnout. Have you had periods like that where you felt like, I don't know if I want to keep going with this for a while, I need to take a break?
I've felt it slightly, but not really like I've heard from other creators, because I've always just been kind of like you, just doing it for the joy of creating. And, you know, anytime you feel that pressure that you have to put out a video, there's a famous quote that I love. A wise man speaks because he has something to say. A fool speaks because he has to say something. And so I'm always like, am I just making a video to say something because I have a time slot to fill, or is there really something to say, you know?
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes if you get caught in that scheduling issue, and a lot of YouTubers have like a very religious schedule, like we have to publish every week or every Tuesday or something, the video has to come out. And that really makes me anxious about the quality when you get locked into a schedule like that. So I don't have a strict schedule, and I know probably you don't either. And it's just you have to be flexible, that if you don't have everything in place for a great video, it's worth spending an extra week to get it right before rushing it out and frustrating everybody that the quality is diluting. I kind of often feel like I'm a huge Tolkien nerd. I often talk about this when people ask me about like my other interests. And Tolkien has this like wonderful thread throughout all of his works that like the quality of things just diminishes over time. And so like the world when it was first made was beautiful, and everything was just, you know, the skill of the smiths, the blacksmiths, was far superior in the old days and the modern days, and nobody can even figure out how people created such wonderful architecture and buildings and swords as they did in the olden times. And I kind of love this idea that you really have to fight and resist back against that natural compulsion of decline a little bit as in the human will. And you know, YouTube is an example of it. There are so many people often talk about like the golden days of YouTube, and it was like maybe 10 years ago or so. It was kind of pre-monetization, really. I think is when people often focus on that period, and there was just a lot of content being made for the sheer joy of making content, and there wasn't a objective to have a career or to make money off it. And of course, it's like anything, as soon as somebody starts making really good content, they eat up all the views, and then everybody else has to kind of lift the scale of their content, which requires investing money to make the quality as high as that next thing. And so it suddenly becomes a rat race to try and like up each other and to up your previous content. And that seems like it should improve the quality, but actually paradoxically often seems to diminish it, because you end up chasing the wrong thing. You end up chasing pure views or whatever the algorithm is telling you to chase, rather than what you started building, which was just something of pure joy, of just something that was just for the craftsmanship of it almost. And I think we often lose that. And so I try to remind myself of that. You know, why did I start this channel? What am I really trying to say in these videos? And to try and maintain that risk of it's so easy to slip. It's so easy to decline.
I totally feel you there. And I think this is a great segue into space talk, because something similar happened with our space program. It seemed like we had all this momentum in the 60s, and we got to the moon, and then there really wasn't a progression of that trajectory. You know, we stopped going to the moon for 50 years. It was almost like there was no progress. And now it's almost like we just assume that technology and things increase with time or get better with time, but they don't. You know, if you look at ancient Egypt and things like that, often the best, most precise built things are on the bottom. They're the oldest. And then the newer things kind of crudely mimic that. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, you know, what happened to our progress in space.
Yeah, I agree. And I think about this a lot when people talk about the Fermi paradox, which is the idea, you know, why don't we see advanced aliens out there? And I think built into the Fermi paradox is an assumption of ever greater technological capabilities as a civilization matures. Just as you say, like you start from a space race, you're landing on the moon, then shortly we'll be on Mars, 10, 20 years later, and then we'll be exploring the outer solar system and then the stars. And that obviously hasn't happened at the pace that we maybe expected, which can be depressing sometimes if you're optimist and you really want to see humanity explore the stars. However, I think it's also a warning sign not to take it for granted. That progress, when you look at the Apollo program, that didn't just happen, right? That was thousands and thousands of people working and putting so much into it, and the country entirely behind it, investing in spirit and monetarily more into space and science than I think we've ever seen in this country before. And that was almost lightning in a bottle, right, to catch that. It was obviously fueled by the space race with the Russians, the Soviets at the time. But I think that magic in a bottle has gone. And so when people look out and talk about space exploration these days, it's often seen as a much lower priority. I mean, it's often depressing to me that the number one thing when we shouldn't talk about politics too much, but when people think about politics, because obviously NASA and space exploration is tied to politics, it's funding, and we did a video about that recently. The number one thing people care about is my back pocket, right? And I think we're all guilty of that. I'm not trying to stand on a soapbox and say I'm like some superior person who doesn't care about my comfort level or something, because we're all guilty of it. But I think the number one issue is always the economy, right, in any political discussion in the United States. And it's just kind of a shame that that's true, because that really means what we primarily care about is our own personal comfort and income level. And we want to buy a nicer sofa and a nicer car and have nicer air conditioners. And that's our priority over the healthcare system or space exploration or fundamental science or education of children. And it's just kind of a shame that it sometimes makes me a little bit sad that the society focuses so much, and we are a capitalist society, so of course it's a product of these years of progression that we've been in this type of society. But it felt like with the Apollo era, that was not the priority. The priority was we're going to spend whatever it takes to beat the Soviets to get to the moon, and it was a matter of prestige primarily, I'd say, rather than the science itself. But the science that came from that was immeasurable. We've learned so much about the moon and the origin of the Earth system, in fact, because of what we've learned from the moon, from the lunar rocks especially, and from all the scans that we've done of the surface and the detailed maps that we have now. Teaches us a lot about the late heavy bombardment, for instance, of how the Earth probably was pummeled with rocks for a very large period of time, and that probably influenced the origin of life and set it back a little bit. So there's just so much you learn from those missions. And I hope that we're turning a corner. It does seem like the work that you hear that SpaceX are doing and the idea of having Starship maybe on the horizon pretty soon is getting people excited again. And I hope that we can re-inspire the public, as I'm trying to do on my channel, that space is our calling, right? I really feel like that. It's like humanity, what are we? We're explorers. We always, when we started out on the African continent, the first thing we want to do is explore to the next continent, explore. It's just in our blood to do that. And I think we have to, for our own sanity, otherwise we're just boiling on this tiny little rock in space. It's part of our DNA that we have to go out and explore. So I really hope that we're turning a corner, but it's ultimately a choice that we all have to make about what our priorities are.
Yeah, and perhaps it's a matter of just kind of tweaking the incentives, because human nature, I think we're always going to be drawn towards seeking that comfort. We want the bigger sofa, we want the good food, we want the big house. That's ultimately what people care about and what they vote for. But if we could align the two, space exploration and the economy, so that maybe space exploration could be the thing that gives us all this abundance. We move our energy base off Earth, or we find these minerals that we desperately need on asteroids. Is there any potential there that we could be moving our energy base off Earth and finding all the solutions that we need for our economy off Earth?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a lot of interest with space mining, especially to industrialize the exploration of space. And it's unclear exactly what that's going to do. I mean, there are some asteroids out there that have more rare earth metals in them than the entire planet Earth does. So like platinum or something. You can find there's a couple of meteorites that have more of that in them than the entire Earth. So in principle, we could go there, we could mine it, we could bring it back. It's not obvious what that would do to the economy, right? Because then now you're flooding the market with 10x times the amount of platinum the Earth has in total. It's going to distort things. So it's not obvious. I'm sure it will have some economic benefit. It's not clear just how sustainable and long-lived that will be. I think the most sustainable, long-lived thing, honestly, is just fundamental science. When you do it, it's a hard sell for people to often wrap their heads around, but studying fundamental science, it doesn't have a immediate benefit. It's hard to see what the immediate benefit will be, but benefits always do follow. And so you think about like quantum theory is probably a good example. In the 1920s, you had theoretical physicists spending, research departments spending all of their research effort on trying to figure out the nature of quantum mechanics, how electrons move, how the orbital shells, transitions, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, all these insights that were coming through. And it really seemed like it was purely theoretical. Like there was just no one thought there'd be an application of quantum theory. It just seemed like it was just for the sake of doing it. But of course, much of our world now depends on quantum theory. I mean, semiconductors are all a product of quantum theory, and every single cell phone, computer chip, and every device has that as a requirement. So if we didn't understand quantum theory, we wouldn't be able to build these tiny few nanometer transistor gate things that we put inside these ever smaller computer chips. So it's not obvious what the benefit of fundamental science will be at the time, but there's always, by discovering, when you discover the rules of nature, how can you play the game if you don't know the rules? How do you expect to master the game and be the best at the game if you don't even know the basic rules of how to play it? You can't be a grandmaster at chess if you don't actually spend some time learning the game. So I think that's what fundamental science is. It's just learning how the universe actually works, and then the exploits will come, because that's in our nature. I'm not worried about that. We'll always find ways to exploit things for our own benefit, but we have to spend time learning the rules. And so I do worry that fundamental science is not held up as a valuable endeavor, but to me, it's the most valuable thing we do. And that ties into exploring space, because there's only so much we can learn here on this planet. And by expanding our basis of operations, we're inevitably going to discover more about the universe.
Yes, I think that's why your channel is so important, because you're inspiring a generation of young people who are often distracted by things that don't really serve them. And then you're showing them, hey, look, this is extremely valuable, but it's also can be really rewarding and fun. So yeah, that's why I really appreciate your channel and other like educational style YouTube channels a lot, because we really need that merge of education and entertainment. I wanted to transition to a quote that I'm sure you've heard a million times and get your take on it. It's from Arthur C. Clarke. He says, "Two possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. I wonder which one terrifies you more."
I think, to be honest, I'm not that terrified by either of them. I would enjoy both. I think both of them are interesting in different ways. And so, yeah, I think I'd say both of them are equally fascinating. Actually, rather than terrifying would be the way I would think about it. I do spend, obviously, an inordinate amount of time thinking about this question ever since I was a child, even before I was a physicist, I was thinking about this question. It is natural, I think, for many of us that we want the answer to be that there are others out there. And it's really interesting, just psychologically, why we feel that way. But it is very common. I think many of us hope there's someone out there to try and almost guide us. It's almost, to many people, it's almost like a substitute for a religion or a god in a way. I think when you look back to ancient times, some religions were often in place more or less as a way of providing guidance, and these deities would come down and provide forgiveness to us for our sins, and maybe shepherd us towards everlasting life after we die, these kind of things. And I think when we think about what an alien species would do, there's two aspects. There's the fear aspect of, well, maybe they might destroy us or enslave us or something that you often see in science fiction. But on the other side, there's often the hopeful side, which is they will teach us, they'll provide us their galactic encyclopedia. If you look at the movie Contact that Carl Sagan wrote, obviously he played with that idea of like they sent us instructions to build this wormhole essentially on Earth that we could travel to another planet. So that idea is very appealing. When I think about alien life, I tend to think that if it is out there, it's probably so alien. And I think this graduation has also been changing over time, that now we tend to think that alien life will be so alien that the idea of even a conversation even if we could translate each other's language, just comprehending what the other one even means. I can use language about my context of my, I'm going to go on my phone and watch TikTok, and then I'm going to run on the treadmill downstairs in the basement or whatever. And these things don't make any sense to an alien who doesn't have any concept of these objects in the first place or the way we live our lives. And so just the very premise of how you would even understand each other seems extremely difficult to me. I mean, I often use this example of a planet could just be an entire fungus, right? You could have an alien being, which is just a colony of fungi, microbes, and they've just formed like a giant neural net. And in that fungus's mind, it is the only thing that has ever lived on its planet. And even the idea of communication might be a totally foreign concept. It just has it doesn't even understand what that would even entail. And so, yes, there is an intelligent being out there, an intelligent alien species, but it's not useful to us in the sense of what our aspirations often are, which is this kind of dialogue and an actual communication. We could sit in a room and they're probably going to shake hands with us, this kind of picture that we have, like from probably fueled by Star Trek. And so I think as our ideas have matured, I'm coming to the acceptance that either we're alone, which is certainly possible. People often dismiss that idea, but we can talk about that more. But I'm very open to the idea that we could be alone. But if we're not, it seems somewhat contrived that they would happen to even have the same kind of mindset as us, that we could understand each other. I mean, even a dolphin, we can't understand really what it means when it's trying to communicate with us, or a humpback whale, or a squirrel monkey. We don't have the ability to communicate with fairly intelligent animals on our own planet, things which were derived genetically from the same universal common ancestor as us. So what hope is there of communicating with something which is so alien? It might not even be based on DNA or carbon, like who knows? I think that's science fiction a little bit, the idea of communication. And I think that was recognized early on. SETI, which is now called the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, used to be called SETI with a C back when it was first created. So that meant communication with extraterrestrial intelligence. But pretty soon after, they realized this is not very realistic. We're probably not going to be able to communicate with these guys. Let's just settle for just detecting them. And maybe that's the best we can ever hope for. And I think that's probably true. I don't think we're ever going to have meaningful conversations, but I do think we could probably answer the question, yes or no, are they out there?
I've seen shows and I've heard ideas that life on other planets might be quite similar to us, because the recipes for life have to be, that planet has to be in that golden zone. There needs to be the right conditions, and there needs to be water, so evolution may not follow this same track. Is that what you're saying? Something could evolve that's so unrecognizable to us that we wouldn't even recognize it as life, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of like the Goldilocks zone, the haplozone, to bring that into bear, for instance, or having an Earth-like planet, this often is built into the argument of what's called the rare Earth hypothesis. That there's a famous book by Ward and Brownlee that proposed this. It's very popular. Recommend you check it out. It's a really interesting read, very thought-provoking. And it is a hypothesis, though. There's no support for it. There's no evidential support that we can really point at to say this must be true. But the idea is indeed that the qualities of the Earth are extremely finely tuned almost for life. And so any world that is capable of hosting life will be very, very similar to the Earth. And thus then you might be tempted to reach into some kind of predictive evolutionary theory, which doesn't really exist, but you could speculate about it and say, well, maybe life would therefore end up similar to us. One of my lecturers at Cambridge, Simon Conway Morris, is a big proponent of this. It's like convergent evolution, that things under the same environmental conditions will tend to converge to the same types of solutions, like the eye. The eye has evolved independently multiple times, for instance. I think a good example is like if you look at a sea animal, like a dolphin and a shark. One's a mammal, one's a fish, but they look very similar, actually. So they've kind of converged to a similar solution for living in the same kind of environment. And so it's tempting to look at that and say, well, maybe, having a hominid, a bipedal hominid with two arms, a head up here, and the eyes in the front, and the mouth on the top, all that kind of makes sense, and you can justify that to yourself. But it is complete speculation in my book, right? We have the example of the Earth, but we don't know that example is in any way typical of other samples. We only have one sample to work with. And it is very tempting then to anthropomorphize these other beings as being an echo of ourselves. And I just think we need to be very careful in doing that. Actually, if you go back to the, Huygens and Cassini and Percival Lowell, like people, astronomers 200, 300 years ago, thinking about life in the universe, they thought there might be life on the moon and Mars, for instance. It's so interesting because when you read what they predicted, they didn't predict any kind of alien creature in the sense of something that would look different to us. It was exactly a human. They predicted there'd be a human essentially with wings, or like angels, but humans living on moon, and human-like creatures living on Mars. And not only that, but they'd probably speak English, and we'd be able to have a conversation with them. And so our default assumption was always that they'd be exactly like us. And the more we've really thought about this, I think the more we've opened up to the idea that, well, why should they be? I mean, there are the number of ways that you can combine chemicals to form different things is just an unimaginably vast number. The chemical, we can't even calculate it, right? So you can't simulate all the possible chemistries on a computer, even with the most powerful supercomputer in the world. There's just too many combinations of ways that you can combine these things. It's a number far greater than the number of atoms in the universe, for instance, the number of combinations you can have. So it's mind-bending just what might be out there. And I always just prefer to be a little bit open-minded and not so arrogant to assume that everything must converge to us, that perhaps there are far, far more different things out there. And after all, there could well be, because the environments we see in the universe are quite diverse. If you look at the most common type of star in the universe, it's a red dwarf star. 75% of all stars in the universe are those. They seem to have very often rocky planets around them in habitable zones as well, so they could have liquid water. But the environment is very, very different to that of the Earth. The light is far redder, so you couldn't have green plants on those worlds, for instance, because photosynthesis wouldn't really work in that environment. You'd have to have probably more darker tuned leaves, for instance, to survive in that condition. The planet would be tidally locked. The atmosphere would have extremely strong winds going from the day to the night side because of that tidal locking. There'd be this strange terminator region where conditions were kind of in between the day and the night and were maybe the most hospitable regions. So the environment, which is the most common type of environment as far as we can tell in the universe, is radically different from that of the Earth. So why should we expect there's going to be human-like beings walking around on that planet? That doesn't quite follow to me. So I think it may be, it turns out to be so, but I definitely wouldn't assume that to be the case.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I read a book about evolution, and it was talking about why things evolved the way they did based on the way our planet moves. And one of the reasons everything sleeps is because planets rotate. And so in order to save energy, you need to either be adapted for day or for night. And so the book took that logic and said, okay, any planet that spins out is going to have a life that sleeps and is awake. So that's one base level of saying that it could be similar to us. It could be something that we could relate to. And then, you can extrapolate more things that other planets do similar things to our planet. Therefore, life would do this. I don't know. That's just a...
No, yeah, the environments are so diverse. I mean, even like Europa and Enceladus, like there could be, well, there almost certainly is an ocean underneath those thick ice shells that we see. These are moons of Jupiter and Europa, Jupiter and Saturn, and these two moons are high priority targets for astrobiologists as potential seats for life because of the existence of liquid water that we think is underneath there. But those moons, yes, they're, it also means what you mean by spinning. So, the moon is tidally locked to the Earth, but it's still spinning. And even if indeed a planet tidally locked to a star is still spinning, it means that the rotation rate equals its revolution rate. So it is still spinning. Otherwise there actually would be a day and a night cycle if it wasn't spinning. So it actually does still have to spin. But anyway, in the case of Europa and Enceladus, they're tidally locked to their host planets. But it's kind of irrelevant because there's no access to stellar illumination. It's a biosphere if there is a biosphere there. It's one that would be fueled purely basically by tidal forces and internal heat generated within the moon due to the gravitational influence of the planets. So it's a completely radically different situation. There'd be no eyes, right? Why would anyone have eyes if you lived in total darkness all the time? Wouldn't really have any value. So you wouldn't really expect that to evolve. And probably they would have senses to chemical gradients in the water that we just don't really see being a priority development on this planet. So the way they'd communicate, the way they'd think, their entire universe would be under a thick shell of ice. So the idea of a cosmos, of astronomy, would be totally foreign to them, even if they were highly intelligent. There are so many things that we take for granted about our planet that maybe life elsewhere does not enjoy those same benefits.
How do we look for life on other planets? Like, what are we even looking for?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Europa Enceladus, it's almost impossible to look for it remotely. You actually really have to fly there and drill down into the ice and sample those things. It's very, very difficult. There are some, in those cases, those moons, there are geysers which come out. So there is spews of water that erupt from the surface through the cracks and the vents on the surface. And Cassini has actually flown through, for Enceladus, actually fortuitously flew through one of those vents as it was spewing out material, and it was actually able to, with its mass spectrometer, to sample that material and determine the composition. And there were some interesting results there. There was some kind of active chemical gradients in there that were maybe surprising, and has been suggested as maybe this means there's a biosphere down there producing these kind of chemical gradients that we see. But it's hard. It's hard to do that just from samples of material. Far better is if you could drill down. For other types of planets, like an Earth-like planet, of course, that's not really necessary. It could be completely covered in cloud, as Venus is. If it's completely covered in cloud, then, again, we're kind of stuck. That's really hard. You want to have a planet that has at least gaps in its cloud, so you could probe down deep into the atmosphere. And not so much that you can see the surface. It'd be great if you could see the surface, but our telescopes are not capable of really doing that for exoplanets, certainly. Maybe we could do it for Venus and Mars, but we can't probe the surface of a distant exoplanet many light years away. So instead, we can sort of smell the atmosphere. We can take the spectrum of light that filters off the atmosphere, that kind of bounces off it, reflects off it, that's emitted by it thermally, and also light that filters through the atmosphere as the planet passes in front of a star. So those three techniques allow us to get a sense as to how light is being absorbed and emitted from the atmosphere itself. And that tells us about the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And that chemical composition is probably our best bet of detecting life, that you might detect combinations of chemicals which we believe could only be produced by life. Now, I say this is where it gets a little bit controversial, because what are those chemicals? For a long time, people would point to oxygen as the example of this, because all oxygen on Earth is made by, or almost all oxygen on Earth is made by photosynthesis. Like if you didn't have photosynthesis, there'd be just trace amounts of oxygen on this planet. And oxygen is a very, very reactive molecule. So it rusts, it reacts with things, it oxidizes things very quickly. So it just doesn't hang around in atmosphere very long. If you took away, you exterminated life on this planet, the oxygen would deplete within a few million years, just from these kind of natural reactions with the surface. So it's an indicator, therefore, that something is biologically producing it. But maybe there's something that's abiologically producing it. And that's where people have been arguing in the literature, in the scientific literature recently. An example of this would be photolysis. So photolysis is a process where ultraviolet radiation from the sun, or from the host star, whatever star it is, hits the upper atmosphere. And if there's water in the upper atmosphere, water is very, very common. It's one of the most common things in the universe, water. Many, many planets we've discovered had water in the atmosphere. It's extremely common in even discovered data at this point. We know this is very common. And the water molecule is split into its constituents. That's hydrogen and oxygen. So now you've got the oxygen. Now the problem is hydrogen is a very, very light atom and very, very light molecule when it combines back into the hydrogen, the molecule, H2. And so it's very easy for it to leave the atmosphere altogether. It can just escape into space. It's the same way you let go of a helium balloon, it just floats up, right? Because it's so light. And indeed, when the helium balloon pops, that helium will actually escape into space. And we're losing helium. Any helium that you release into the atmosphere, basically it goes into space eventually. You're not going to be able to hold on to it, because the Earth's gravity is not strong enough to hold on to it. If we were on Jupiter, it could hold on to it, but on the Earth, it cannot hold on to it. We lose those light molecules. So the hydrogen floats off into space. You've got the oxygen, which is heavy enough to stay in the atmosphere. And now you have an oxygen-rich atmosphere purely driven by a non-biological process. So to have that, you'd probably have to have some kind of ocean loss. So imagine you had an ocean that boiled off and formed a H2O-rich atmosphere, and you'd have to have ultraviolet radiation. That combination would probably be enough to give you an oxygen-rich atmosphere that we would erroneously conclude was life if we're not careful. So this is why, looking for life is very difficult, and you have to really think hard about the context of what could be creating these things and how much we really believe the signatures we're seeing.
God, that was a beautiful answer. It blew my mind. I never thought about gases as having weight and being held down by the mass of a planet. So yeah, that's really amazing that different gases will not rise up on like Jupiter.
Yeah, a good example to see this visually is dry ice. So, dry ice is carbon dioxide, frozen carbon dioxide, and you often see it in a performance of like a musician or someone. They'll throw it on stage, the dry ice, and you'll see it sinks. It doesn't go up into the air. It sinks back down, and that's what carbon dioxide does. Carbon dioxide likes to sink down to the lowest level it can because it's heavier than the mean molecular mass of most air. So the mass has a huge bearing on the distribution of gases within the atmosphere, and unfortunately, our planet just isn't massive enough to hold on to some of those lighter ones. If it did, it'd actually give us a huge greenhouse effect. Hydrogen is actually a very, very potent greenhouse gas. And so if the Earth had enough mass to hold on to hydrogen, and it probably at one point had a hydrogen atmosphere, probably when it was first born, there probably was a hydrogen atmosphere around the Earth, but because our mass is too low, we lost it very quickly within a few million years. But had we had enough mass to hold on to it, because hydrogen is so abundant, it's everywhere, had we held on to it, we'd have a very intense greenhouse, even more intense greenhouse scenario than we have today. So that's interesting because it means there could be planets, thinking about other worlds again, there could be planets like the Earth, which are a bit more massive, like a super Earth, but further away from the star, so they'd be too cold to have life on it, we'd normally think. But if they have the hydrogen atmosphere, then they'd have enough greenhouse warming that they could actually sustain liquid water on their surface. So there could be hydrogen puffballs out there that are sustaining life. So this is why we have to be like very open-minded about what could be out there. That's a totally different environment to the one we enjoy.
This makes me think, is there a way that we could maybe manipulate another planet like Mars, manipulate their atmosphere so it's more habitable for life?
Yeah, so terraforming essentially, like trying to make the planet look more similar to the Earth. Yeah, Mars is a common target of our dreams of doing this, of course. Venus is sometimes spoken about as well. The problem with Mars is it is very low mass. It's I think it's a tenth the mass of the Earth. So its gravity is not quite as bad. It's not a tenth. It's something like maybe a half, I think, or 40% or so. Because of its smaller size. So it's about half the size of the Earth, about 10% the mass, I think. And as a result of that, its gravity is about 40%, right? So it's going to be like 2/5 if you do the math. So anyway, this planet is going to be even harder to put an atmosphere on it. And so one of the reasons it has such a thin atmosphere is probably because it lost it as a result of its low surface gravity. Once upon a time, it seems likely that Mars did have an atmosphere, and it was lost both through its low gravity, but also through solar activity. The sun's high energy radiation can create an effect in atmospheres called sputtering that can basically chip away molecules off the top of the atmosphere and chip them off into space. And if you don't have a magnetic field, the Earth has a very strong magnetic field, Mars does not, then you're very exposed to this type of atmospheric loss phenomena. So Mars is kind of a double problem when it comes to holding to an atmosphere, low gravity and a lack of magnetic field. We can't really change either of those things. You can't really generate a magnetic field on Mars unless you had the ability to go right into the core and dump huge amounts of energy. I don't know if anyone really seriously thinks we could do that. And you certainly can't really change the mass. I mean, that's just another planet you're now talking about. So the only option you have is to have a temporary atmosphere. So you could do that. You could pump out, you could have these, factories that pump out gases or something to try and create an atmosphere. But it'd be a losing battle. You'd essentially have to constantly replenish it because over time it would just naturally erode. So it could be done. It would take a lot of effort and continuous maintenance, because Mars naturally does not want to have an atmosphere. So it would take a lot of continuous labor to maintain it.
Yeah, there seems to be a romantic idea that people are going to end their lives on Mars. People alive on Earth today, I think I heard Lex Friedman say that he would like to spend his last days on Mars. And do you think that in our lifetime we'll see a baby born on Mars?
I don't know. I think maybe a baby born on Mars is actually more feasible to me than a colony. So maybe like a sustained colony. I often think about with the idea of colonizing Mars, it might be similar to like sort of, you look at the old colonies in the US, in the United States, like Jamestown, and there's these colonies that were founded and they just couldn't survive. They lasted maybe a couple of decades and then they disappeared because the conditions are just, in the United States even, are very, very difficult for Europeans without much technology to survive in. Very, very challenging conditions, and it doesn't take much, like a little disease, to wipe out the entire village. So I think surviving in Mars we often underestimate how hard that would be. To give you some context, it's much harder to survive on Mars than it would be in Antarctica. Right? Antarctica, you've got an oxygen atmosphere, but the temperature is similar in Antarctica as it is to Mars. But Antarctica has way more water as well. So everything about Antarctica is far, far superior as a place to live than Mars. But we don't have cities in Antarctica. Like, we don't have colonies there. There's vast amounts of land there that you'd think, if you want space to live, why not buy up some property in Antarctica? Great. Nice, beautiful oceanside views. But nobody's interested in doing that because it is so unbelievably difficult to live there. You'd be incredibly miserable. So it's not obvious to me that I don't have any draw to move to Mars in my lifetime. So I think that Earth is the most beautiful planet I can possibly imagine. Why would you leave paradise to live on Mars? But I suspect I'm not representative of everybody. There will be some people who are drawn to the challenge of living there. And I guess a key difference, to be fair, to Mars versus Antarctica is that there's a reason for living there that doesn't really translate to Antarctica, and that's this idea of becoming a multiplanetary species and providing an insurance policy against extinction. So having a colony on Mars makes sense, right? Because if Earth gets hit by a giant meteor or something, it could wipe out all life, or there could be a giant war here, whatever. You could lose all life on Earth, and then you've got this backup scenario on Mars. But I don't want to be the backup. It's not what I'm interested in doing. I'd rather live in the prime real estate. Thank you very much. So I could imagine in our lifetime, depending on the progress we see with Starship and with the plans that Elon has talked about with building colonies on Mars, I can imagine it happening. But I'm not convinced it's sustainable. I think that's something that's I need to be convinced of. But I know there are many optimists who just think we have to try it. It's so important for the future of humanity to try it. And I don't deny that it's important to try it. It's just, I think it's extremely challenging to do so.
This may be a bit of a silly question, but is there any ethical issue with us colonizing space? I mean, you could argue that what the Europeans did colonizing the world was not right. And then is it right for us to just go and take over other planets?
Yeah, I mean, even the word colonization is quite loaded, right? And so, I want to be cognizant of that there has been a push that actually we should change the language we use and maybe talk about settlement or something else rather than colonization, because it does cut it immediately. As you note, it immediately spurs these thoughts of the darkest chapters of humanity's history. And so if we're going to move to Mars, however you want to call it, we probably almost want to rebrand it in a sense to not think that we're going to repeat the mistakes of the things that we did in the past. Obviously, it is very different because there are no indigenous people on Mars. As far as we know, there are no indigenous people on Mars for us to exploit. But that doesn't mean exploitation couldn't happen, especially if it's a corporation that owns the colony, which seems the most likely way that we're seeing happening right now. If you have a company own the colony, then your right for oxygen which is a precious resource, would be governed by the company. And so that might become your salary effectively, to have oxygen and food provided to you. And that treads very closely now to a form of enslavement, essentially. These people would, for their very survival, would depend on labor. It wouldn't be particularly like a retirement home place in that situation, right? Unless you're extremely wealthy. So those are some analogies that I think people worry about with a potential colony. And then also there is the ethical issue of, even though there's no indigenous people on Mars, there could be indigenous life. We don't know that's not true. There could be some microbial life forms living maybe a few centimeters underneath the surface that we just haven't detected yet. And our very presence would potentially disrupt that very fragile biosphere, you'd have to assume, potentially contaminating it, or even introducing viruses or something that could lead to a collapse of that biosphere. And so that's just a scientific tragedy, because I think as we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, one of the greatest questions you want to answer is, to understand and search for life in the universe. And if it's right underneath our boots and we just tread all over it and trample it and destroy it, that just seems like an enormous tragedy, that we've lost that potential tomb of knowledge that we could access. So we do have to think very carefully about what our influence would be and how we might contain that influence if we did plan to move to another world.
Gosh, I never thought about that idea of how we could be enslaved, because all our needs would depend on the corporation, oxygen and food and everything that we take for granted. But it made me think, what about genetically engineering humans or life to be more adapted to that planet that we go to, so we don't need oxygen or we don't need as much light?
Yeah, I don't know how I'm not a geneticist. I don't know if it's even possible to modify a human to not need oxygen, but certainly the idea of modifying humans is a trope in science fiction, like the Expanse series and the books play with that idea a little bit, or at least not really directed genetic manipulation, but just actually natural evolution. By a product of being in space for so long, what they call them, the people the belters, I think they're called in the books, the belters, people who live in the asteroid belt, their physiology just actually adapts to that environment over time. And so they have like very low bone density, for instance, and very little muscle mass, such that if you put them back on Earth, they can't survive on Earth anymore because their physiology has changed so much. So certainly there have been lots of science fiction novels and stories which have played around with that idea. I don't know if that. I don't know. If they're purely serving us as a way of, okay, we need someone to clean the plasma vents or something, or we need somebody to fix this problem out on the shell out there in space, then maybe it makes more sense, I would think, to use machines for such a purpose, rather than genetically engineering humans to do so. Because let's face it, machines are getting extremely intelligent these days. There's no reason why they couldn't serve many of those functions that we need, and they'd be very well adapted, of course, by design for the environment they live in. I think genetically engineering people is just a huge ethical question. Like, do we have the right to really change humanity's physiology and genetic material in that way? Have designer babies is like a whole other topic, that has been very contentious. So I think the least controversial ethical thing to do, put it that way, would be to use machines for maintaining the conditions of space, or the machinery in space, and then hopefully you produce a habitat in which humans would be able to survive, because the conditions within that volume would be similar to the conditions we enjoy here on Earth. So artificial gravity, you create artificial gravity by spinning as a vessel. So if you just spin something in space, that will create a centrifugal force which mimics the effects of gravity. We did a video about this ages ago on our YouTube channel. If the ship is too small, that spinning is very disorienting. So it kind of gives you, because there's a Coriolis force effect which comes along for the ride, and that really disorients the human brain a lot, makes you feel very ill. But people can adapt to it. There's been experiments where they've been able to, even with a few meters across, they can get people to adapt. at least test pilots, military test pilots they've got in these environments. And after a few days, they can do complex tasks adapting to these Coriolis forces. But if you just make the vessel much longer, like hundreds of meters or even a kilometer long or something, some huge space habitat, that spinning is very slow. And so it's actually not really disorienting at all. And people should be able to experience both, an oxygen atmosphere, gravity, all the conditions of the Earth just in a space environment. So I think that would be maybe more attractive to most of us. I'm not sure many of us really like the idea of being modified, and we would rather modify the environment to suit us rather than modify us to the environment. But that's maybe a preference thing rather than a logical thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It seems like people are pretty quick to want to modify themselves, though. Just if the incentives are there, you have people rushing out to get plastic surgery. Now people are lining up to put the Neuralink in their brain. So you don't know.
Yeah, maybe it's just me then. I don't understand why people want to do that. I do not want a computer chip in my brain.
I mean, that is a great point that you make, that why are people lining up to live on Mars when you don't see anybody lining up to live on Antarctica when it's right here and it's got better conditions? That's a great point.
Well, there are some people, but it's a fringe. It's an extreme. I mean, there's the British Antarctica Research Base there. And when I was a student, I remember as an undergrad, I was really interested in going to Antarctica to do a research project there. One of my best friends back home in the UK did it. And on the way back, the ship sank. It started taking on water. So in between Antarctica and Chile, it was on Christmas Day, the ship started to take on water. And they had to bail from the lowest deck. I think it was like 6 or 7 decks. And they made a line of people, and they got a bucket, and they were literally passing this bucket of water all the way up the deck and out the ship. And they had to do that for something like 10 or 12 hours. They were bailing the ship, and their arms were just exhausted. And then a helicopter came and picked them up and flew them off. And he has a picture of him wearing a Santa outfit because it was Christmas Day, so they're all wearing like Christmas stuff. So he's wearing a Santa outfit, being pulled away on a rope by a helicopter off this ship that's just like half in the water. And I mean, it's a difficult place to survive, even with all of that modern technology. It's been a difficult place to survive, and there isn't going to be a helicopter saving you on Mars. So it's challenging. I get the appeal of it. But the vast majority of people would say, we talked about comfort right at the beginning of this video. I think the vast majority of people would say, including myself, I think I'd rather stay at home.
Yeah, I totally see your point. Another big question I wanted to ask you, what came before the Big Bang?
Oh man, that's almost like asking what's north of the North Pole. To paraphrase, I think it was Stephen Hawking might have said that. It's a question which doesn't necessarily have an answer, or even it necessarily is a question we can even meaningfully ask. Time, as far as we understand it, began with the event of the Big Bang. So to ask what was before the Big Bang is to ask what was before time started, which doesn't make sense. You can't have a time before time started. So if time really did begin with the Big Bang, which we think is quite plausible, not necessarily true, but quite plausible, then the question doesn't really have any answer. There's no answer I can give you to that question. It's not very satisfying, but it doesn't really make sense as a question. If there was something before the Big Bang, maybe there was a cyclic universe or some high dimensions of universes that float around and collide into each other, triggering Big Bangs. There's lots of ideas as to what might have caused that. Some kind of conformal cosmology model, as Roger Penrose likes to call it. In that kind of situation, we could speculate about what was before, but it's very, very difficult, arguably I would say impossible, to ever answer that question again, because the Big Bang was an immensely destructive event. In fact, for a fraction of a time, it's like if you go back to like 10 to the power minus 100 seconds, like these tiny, tiny, tiny intervals of time, the temperature approaches infinity. And so in that condition, no information could possibly propagate from the previous universe into the next one. Everything is just basically obliterated and wiped clean through that Big Bang event. Some people think there could be echoes, gravitational echoes. Penrose likes that idea, but that's been challenged by many other colleagues as well. So there's some debate about that still, but it seems, from as far as we can tell, I think the least, the majority view at the moment, the consensus view, is that essentially you can't really have information easily propagate from a previous universe into the next one. And if that's true, then the question actually isn't scientific, as frustrating as that may be. If we cannot design an experiment to test a hypothesis or a claim, it's no longer within the realm of science. Science can only tackle questions which we can make experimental tests of, and that's it. If there's no experimental test I can ever do, even in principle, to evaluate that hypothesis, then it's more of a question of philosophy and metaphysics than it is of physical reality, of science. That's not very satisfying. It doesn't mean it's less interesting, but it just means that I'm probably not equipped to answer that question because I am speaking mostly as a scientist today, and I just do not have the tools or any special insight to provide it to you. I think I did a video about this a while ago on my channel about how I understand the frustration deeply, and it is probably for me, this idea of what was before or what triggered is the most infuriating and deepest question we could possibly ask. And you might imagine we eventually came up with some physical theory that explained why the Big Bang happened. Maybe we discovered some grand unified theory of everything. We united quantum theory, we united general relativity, and we discovered it. We had this one equation, and the equation was something really beautiful, like A equals B times X. And we could look at that equation, and it derived every single law of physics, the mass of the electron, the spin of the proton, everything just naturally came out of this equation, including why the Big Bang happened. And you could look at it and say, okay, now I get it. Like, it had to be because of this equation. But even that wouldn't be very satisfying, because now you would ask, well, where does that equation come from? I mean, why is it A equals B times X rather than A equals B divided by X or plus X or some other operator? Like, why is it that particular equation? That implies that equation represents information. And so then where did that information come from? Like someone put information into the universe, it seems like, in that case. And that's and then you could, well, maybe there's a multiverse, there's all the possible equations, but even that landscape of equations would still have to have some bound of like what's possible, and that would also be a defined amount of information. Even that volume of equations would be a defined amount of information. And so even boiling it down to just an informatics perspective, which is like the simplest way I can imagine really thinking about it, there is still something that cannot be answered. And so sometimes we talk about this as being a brute fact. And it's a real, like, just dodging the bullet type statement to make, not very satisfying, but a brute fact is something which just has to be true, and there's not really any point arguing about why it's true. Just swallow that pill and accept the brute fact that the universe just is, and that's all we can really say. That is obviously a fact that is true, but trying to seek an explanation for it, there must be a recursion. You know, if I give you this happens because of this happens because of this happens because of this, whatever answer I give you, you'd always be able to say, well, why does that happen? Why? It's like my 5-year-old does the same thing. Daddy, why? And eventually, you just have to get to a point where you just have to say, because it is like that. There has to be a bottom. It can't just be infinity whys. So that bottom will necessarily be a brute fact, of which there is no satisfying explanation. And it's a deep puzzle. I suspect there's just something, maybe it's just my brain, maybe other people can understand it. I suspect it's just a limitation of our intelligence. I just don't, why should the human brain, this, few kilogram thing in a primate head, why should we expect it to be capable of understanding everything in the universe? There's no reason why it has to be so. There may just simply be things that we absolutely cannot comprehend, and I suspect this is one of those questions.
That was a brilliant answer. Yeah, and you really lit my brain up in a number of ways. There's a thing called Agrippa's Trilemma. Have you heard of this?
Don't think so.
It is the three different explanations of, there's the of like the meaning of life, or like why do we exist, or the big existential questions. You can either keep going why to infinity. You can go why forever. That's one. You can do circular reasoning. Why is A because of B? Why is B because of A? Or you can have a definitive stop, like why is this? Because of God. It all came from God. And so those are your three options, and you know, you can kind of see which route people go down, but the constant why is very unsatisfying.
Yeah.
And they're all unsatisfying in their own way a little bit. So do any of these deep questions of science ever lead you to God in any way, or like a religious view?
No, I mean, not really. So I was actually religious. I was brought up in a religious household. So my parents were both Protestants, Christians, and they went through phases of how religious they were. But we used to go to church every Sunday, and went to Sunday school until probably like 11 or 12 years old. Went to church, things like this. And I think, one of the ways I sort of thought about religion was as a way of, as we alluded to here, like explaining things. Like, okay, why is there a universe? Why did humans develop? These kind of questions. And you say, well, God guided that, or God created that. And it kind of was satisfying, I guess, to a point. Like, okay, that explains things. But the more I learned about science, because I was so interested in science as a young child in space, the more I realized that many of the explanations I've been told, things that God did, could be explained without God. And so it seemed like God was receding, both historically and in my mind. There was all these things that God was supposed to explain that actually, why the sun rises. Oh, that's God. Oh, actually, no, it's not. It's because the earth revolves around the sun. Why does the rain fall? Yeah, God does that. Oh, actually, no, we understand it's precipitation of clouds. So, you go through these things that we thought long, long ago had to be the act of supernatural beings. And so even the things we don't understand, like the Big Bang, these remaining questions that we have, just the pattern, the historical pattern of, okay, all these things that we used God as an explanation for, it retreated, that deity retreated from, essentially, our understanding no longer required the God to explain it. In my mind, by extrapolation, it seemed obvious that these remaining mysteries would also have scientific explanations, just ones that presently eluded us. And there was no need scientifically for a God, in my mind. I know other people feel differently. And there are many scientists, this is such a delicate issue, who feel very strongly the other way. I think it's just something we all have to arrive at in our own mindset. I remember when I was young, I used to really enjoy debating religion with people. And going through it and trying to convince people there was no God. When I was like 15, 14, I sort of turned away from all that. And then as I got older, I feel totally the opposite now. I have no interest in debating religion, because I actually never want to take religion away from people. I'm actually just envious of people who have religion, because they have in their mind this being who is looking after them in their everyday life, is looking, someone who's there for them. You're not lonely, right? Because there's this kind of voice almost behind you in your mind. And when you die, you believe you're going to probably go to an afterlife in most of the religions. And I would never want to take that away from somebody, because I think even if it's an illusion, obviously I believe it's an illusion, but even if it is an illusion, it's an illusion which probably makes you extremely happy and content. And whatever you really believe in that last moment of life, in a way, is kind of true, right? Because that last moment, in a sense, extends to infinity from your perspective. So I'd never want to remove from somebody their faith. So, yeah, I'm actually a little bit envious of people who have deep religion, but in the same time, I can't force myself to change I'm not going to do the, what's it called? The fallacy bet, where you just sort of, as an insurance policy, pretend to. I don't think you can pretend to believe. You either believe or you don't believe. I think Pascal's wager, who said, well, it's better to believe and be wrong, right? Because if you believe and it turns out you're right, even though you initially thought you were wrong, then you'll go to heaven. If you bet in religion and it turns out you're wrong, then you're in the same situation you were before anyway. So why not just believe for the sake of it? But you can't make yourself believe. And it's like a placebo effect. Once you know you're taking a sugar pill, you can't not know that. It's like it's not going to work as a placebo once you know it's a sugar pill. So I just have envy for it, and that's why I don't ever talk about it really in much detail on the channel. Because I don't want to perturb people. I know a lot of people, maybe look up to what I'm saying, and I just think if you believe, that's yours, and I don't want to touch it.
That's a great attitude, and I think that's definitely a smart approach, because religion is a very touchy subject, and everybody's got their own version of what God is and what heaven is and the afterlife, and something I've tried to do on my channel is strip all that away. I strip all the words that we have all this emotion attached to, and kind of just look at like the reward that you get from a spiritual life, and acknowledging that we are temporary physical things with a soul, and we're having a spirit, we're having a physical experience, but we are these possibly these eternal conscious beings. And maybe that's false, but it is a very it does help you orient your life. It might not be a great explanation for scientific things, but it is a very useful way to just humbly live your life and kind of bow down to the mysteries of the universe and say there's always going to be a greater mystery. Even if we solve this one, there's going to be another one, and I'm okay with that. I can live at peace with that and know that, I'm okay with that. And it is comforting, I guess. I could go on and on about this, I don't want to, derail our whole conversation talking about religion.
Well, I will say to kind of come back to the question of alien. I do think about theology a lot in terms of the connection to alien life, because, and actually, some of the recent SETI meetings I've been to, there've been theologians there, present and presenting research, and there's a lot of connections between them, I think. And I alluded to this earlier, but there are a lot of people who, if you don't have a God in your life, you might look to aliens as almost the replacement figure, right? There could be this fatherly figure that will come down from above and teach us the error of our ways, and maybe even promise eternal life and all this kind of stuff. And in that sense, there's a connection. And in another sense, there's a connection of explanation of phenomena. So as I said, we used to have these phenomena in the natural world we couldn't explain, and we would invoke a God as our explanation. And so often we do that with aliens as well. So Oumuamua is a good example, right? This weird interstellar asteroid that came through the solar system. We didn't understand what it was. It looked like no asteroid we'd ever seen before. And so our immediate, or not everyone's immediate, but some people's immediate explanation is that must be aliens. And you see humans do this all the time. The pyramids. How could they possibly build the pyramids? Okay, aliens. How could that star strangely pulsate in this weird way we've never seen before? Well, that must be aliens. And just every time we come across something we don't understand, we invoke basically a miracle, right? And we dress it up like it's not a miracle, because we say aliens, and aliens is a scientific hypothesis we claim. But really, to me, it's no different from invoking God, right? To say, well, God did that. God made that asteroid do that. It's not really any different from saying an alien did that. And equally, it's infinitely evasive. So I can't design an experiment to disprove God. And I also can't design an experiment to disprove aliens. You could say, I saw a UFO on Tuesday, on Wednesday, and on Thursday. Come join me on Friday and we'll see it. And I come on Friday and it's not there. And you could say, oh, the alien didn't feel like coming on Friday, I guess. And I can't disprove to you the alien wasn't real. And in the same sense, I can't, it's infinitely evasive as a hypothesis in the same way that God's can be. So I think there is a really interesting connection that we don't talk about a lot, which is a lot of the ways people, even scientists, use aliens, whether it be in the History Channel's Ancient Aliens TV show, all the way up to legitimate astronomers invoking it, is used in exactly the same way that we used to use gods to explain the world around us. And that to me is a warning sign that we're not being careful enough in the way we approach the subject.
Yeah, well said. I've said this a number of times, but I don't believe there is such thing as atheism. You're going to worship something, and whether you realize it or not, we are inherently religious creatures. So, you see a lot of people that have shied away from religion, but then they go turn around and they worship a politician or money or intellectuals or celebrities or, whatever you name it. And if you worship a lot of these things, these so-called false idols, you could go down like a dead-end road and get used and taken advantage of. Whereas the advantage of these long-standing religions is they've been around for thousands of years and they've been tried and tested and they're still here. And for some reason, evolution keeps selecting for those who are religious. And so it keeps on going on. So that's just another idea.
Yeah.
Something to think.
I think there's some interesting connections there. And I think we're just really scratching the surface of this. And I'm pleased to see, as I said, I'm pleased to see theologians and religious thinkers actually engage on these topics, because I think there's a lot we can learn from each other.
Yeah. The person that came up with the Big Bang Theory was a priest, right? I believe he was a bishop or a priest.
Yeah. So it's Fred Hoyle. I'm thinking of the debate. I'm blanking on it now. It was Fred Hoyle who was... the name Big Bang came from Fred Hoyle, who was a Cambridge physicist. And he was adamantly against the idea. He thought it was preposterous. So he called it the Big Bang as an insult almost, to try and like ridicule it, and it ended up sticking as the name. But I can't. The name's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't quite get it out right now. So you'd have to look it up afterwards.
Yeah,
I'm afraid. Yeah.
One thing I've given a lot of thought to is the possibility of an asteroid hitting Earth, and it's kind of crazy. If you look up articles, sometimes these things whiz by Earth like every month, and fairly close, like closer than the moon is far away from us. How concerned are you about a asteroid hitting Earth? Are we due?
I'm not overly worried about that. I think the probabilities of a extinction level event is on a time scale that's far, far longer than human lifetimes. I think it's of order of sort of many millions of years, but I have to obviously look up the exact number. But you're talking like, I think, tens of millions of years typically for these events to happen. There's no like due. There's no due date, right? I think that's like gambler's fallacy. Like you go to the casino, and if you've lost 5 hands in a row, you might think, well, I'm due for a win on the next hand. But each hand is completely independent of the last hand. There's no memory. It's not like an asteroid has a clock and it's like looking, oh, it's been a while since we hit Earth, we should probably go over again. That's just not how statistics work. Each event's totally random to the last one. So even if we had just been hit by one, the probability of being hit again in the next year is the exact same probability as it is today after a long, long interval of not being hit by one. So there's no, I think that, we often see that headline, Earth is due, but I think that's just misrepresenting how statistics truly work. So there is obviously a finite probability. I would put it very low down on the, I've thought about doing this as a video, like a list of top 10 existential threats, and I think it's very low down on the list. I think the most likely risk is ourselves. We're our own worst enemy. One thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is it's kind of obvious but also just terrifying is the threat of nuclear weapons. And we have the capability with nuclear weapons to exterminate human civilization essentially on this planet. I don't think we could maybe exterminate all life on this planet, but we could probably totally end what we call civilization on this Earth in a giant nuclear war, which is a terrifying prospect. And you might ask, well, what's the probability of that happening? Now, it's almost incalculable, right? It depends on the psychology of the actors involved and the probability of an accident, and it's in principle it could be calculated, but in practice there's just no way we could actually calculate that number. But it must be a number, and that number must be greater than 0%. There can't be a 0% chance of a nuclear weapon being randomly fired by a rogue actor. It has to be a finite probability. So if that probability is, let's say, 1 in 1,000, let's say, each year of that happening, then it's not really a question of if there will be a nuclear war. It's just a question of when. As long as the probability is not 0, in the same way of a meteorite hitting the Earth, as long as that probability is not 0, it's not a question of if a meteor will hit the Earth again. It will. It's just a question of when that meteor will hit, because the probability is not 0 each year of it happening. In the same way, nuclear war is inevitable on this planet. I think mathematically that has to be true. I mean, a total wipeout nuclear war is inevitable on this planet, unless we did not have nuclear weapons. The only way to save ourselves from inevitable nuclear war is to remove the nuclear weapons. That's it. And it's just very clear to me mathematically that has to be true. And all these arguments about mutual assured destruction and like the nuclear weapons keep us safe, I understand the strategic argument for that, but it's just a time bomb of an inevitable event that's in our future, a horizon that will come to pass if we do not remove them. So yeah, thinking about that recently, I've been totally convinced that it's something that we absolutely have to remove off the face of this planet.
Yeah, I did a podcast recently with Daniel Schmachtenberger, who focuses a lot on this issue, and he says it's just a matter of game theory, how every country is kind of like looking at their options and saying, okay, well, I don't want to be subjugated to being ruled over by other countries that have nuclear weapons. So they're looking at their map of options, and they're saying, okay, obviously, in order to be respected on a global level, I need to become a nuclear power. That's the only way to be economically and politically viable. Because if I'm not, I get left in the dust. So we have these really perverse incentives that are kind of creating a future that nobody wants, but we all feel like we need to go down this route. It's kind of similar to AI. You know, how we're all seeing that this is probably going to be the end of humans biologically, but we're in this arms race to be the first to create this general AI, you know?
Yeah, I think we have an obsession for short-term positioning, short-term gain, manipulation at the grave expense of long-term advantage. And yeah, I think both of those are good examples. Climate change, equally so. I mean, if the human lifetime, I think actually one hopeful aspect here is life extension technologies. If the human lifetime was 1,000 years, we would think about climate change totally differently. If everybody lived, the problem is there are so many people, older people especially, who say, my parents are in that bucket, unfortunately, and they often say, well, I'm going to be dead, who cares, like I'm going to be out of here, so it doesn't really affect me. But if our lifetime was 1,000 years, you couldn't have that view, because this is something that's going to happen to you like next month, essentially, in your lifespan, right? So it would just be crazy to engage in climate change knowing that this is something you're going to suffer with pretty soon. So I think a lot of issues that we're facing as a species, economically, in terms of combating the climate, artificial intelligence, nuclear war, a lot of those issues I think we would look at totally differently if our lifespans were far, far longer. We would have more of a responsibility, I think, to solve problems once and for all, rather than just sticking a band-aid on them until I'm out of here, and then it doesn't really matter. And that's just incredibly infuriating, of course, to young people who think, well, I'm the one who's going to have to pick up the tab on this. So it's the same with like the economy, like with debt. So I have to think about that. Like a lot of people are kind of infuriated. A lot of young people I speak to in my classes who are just moving into the workforce, they're almost depressed about the state. They're so depressed about the state of the world in a way I've not seen before. And they say to me, I'm never going to buy a house. It's just, I've accepted that. I'm never going to buy a house. The world is probably going to get worse and worse from this point because of climate change. And I've just accepted that. And so I'm just going to try and enjoy, my life as much as I can the next 10 years. And they have no long-term plan. Like instead of when we were younger, maybe we'd save money for a house, save up money for a deposit or something. But instead, they're just thinking, well, I may as well just spend all my money on a Rolex, right? Because, like, why not? Like, I'm never going to get a house, so why bother? So, like, the short-termism has almost exacerbated and compounded. And now even the next generation, not everybody, but I know some folks who feel this way, have taken this almost super extreme version of it, where in their mind, there's no future, so just purely live for today. And it's obviously the total opposite of like building a cathedral or something, right? When you build a cathedral, you're never going to see the cathedral built in your lifetime. It takes hundreds of years to build the cathedral. But each generation does it because they believe it will eventually be built and it will contribute towards society in a positive way. And I think we've just sort of lost that cathedral building mentality. And we've become totally focused on the short term.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I have noticed that as well with people my age and younger, is like our attention span is so short, and it's like we've got this throwaway culture where if something doesn't work, you just throw it away and you order a new one on Amazon, and everything around us is just so quickly and temporarily built, and it makes you feel kind of cheap and temporary yourself. But then you go to a cathedral and you see something that took many generations to build, and you kind of stop, and it changes your consciousness in a way and makes you feel like you're part of something that could be eternal. And I think that's something that maybe our very materialistic culture is missing.
Yeah. It may be a phase. I think, whenever I try to put my optimist hat on, I just think, well, maybe this is just a phase. Maybe everything, things swing in roundabouts, and there probably were periods in history where people felt similarly. But it does seem like we're on a escalating train in a way that history has never seen before, of just every year the amount of information that's printed onto the internet, published on the internet, sort of exceeds all previous years cumulatively or something. There's like some crazy statistics like that, right? The amount of information we generate just grows exponentially, and thus the timescales of everything, the timescale of adoption of technologies, like with how long it took people to go into Facebook versus how long it took people to get into ChatGPT. It's like you're talking a couple of weeks for ChatGPT versus many years for Facebook, and just everything, just that adoption and that cycle just seems to get faster and faster and faster, and it's kind of exhausting to live through it. So yeah, I'm just grateful. I really am grateful for the work I do as an astronomer, because the universe forces you to think about things in very long time scales, and just to appreciate the fleetingness of everything on here, and how like relax. The universe almost like relaxes you. We can't destroy the universe, right? We can't, at least not yet, but we can't destroy there's nothing we can really do to perturb the universe. The universe just is out there doing its own thing, and there's something relieving about that we are just an observer, not a participant really to what the universe is up to. And it feels a little bit terrifying that we're being dragged along on the earth with all these currents of cultural currents and political currents, technological currents. But the universe is like a breath of calm to me. It's like a little meditative time to yourself. So if you're feeling stressed about the world, yeah, I do encourage you to dive into learning about the universe. And I think it will provide some relief. At least for me, it certainly does mentally, about some context about what it all means out there.
That's beautiful. I think about the universe in kind of a geometric form. You can tell me, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but I think of it as like a torus shape or like an apple. And the Big Bang is kind of like the center of the apple where everything expands out. And we are on the outside of that apple. And we're maybe heading towards the bottom of the apple, coming into something like the singularity, where everything comes back together again into the center of that apple core and then shoots back out again. I don't know. That's just a geometric thought that I have. I like to think of things in geometric patterns, but
yeah, we did a video about the shape of the universe a while back on my channel. I think it's called "How Big Is the Universe?" that I recommend people check out on this. And it is an open question. What is the shape of the universe and how large is it? Those two questions are kind of intertwined with each other. As far as we can tell, observationally, the universe is incredibly flat. By which I mean in some kind of, if there is some apple, some curvature, some hyperdimensional space in which the universe is embedded, the part on which we live appears almost totally flat. So I guess it's like why on the Earth our ancestors thought the Earth was flat. Some people still do. But you think the Earth is flat because you look around you and it appears flat. But of course, if you fly an aeroplane or go into space, you can see the curvature start to pop in as you get that larger scale come into view. Now we can't we can't zoom out of the universe and see that greater scale, unfortunately. We can only see the little patch that we're on, like an ant crawling on the surface of an apple. So it could well be that there's curvature that we don't yet detect. However, we can put some pretty good limits on how curved it could be. And it implies that the universe has to be hundreds of billions, at least, light years in diameter. So it's certainly larger, much larger, we think, than the volume that we see around us. An open question, though, is could there be shapes which appear flat, but actually still are cyclic? So a cylinder is actually kind of an interesting example of that. You can walk along the rim of the cylinder and it appears pretty flat, but it can actually wrap around in one of the directions back in on itself. And there's even more complex geometries like this where you can, essentially what we mean by flatness is could you like unfold it into a flat piece of paper? That's really what cosmologists mean by flatness. So yeah, if I took a flat piece of paper, I could roll it up into a cylinder without any crinkles or ripples in the paper. But I couldn't do that for a sphere. You can't take a flat piece of paper and make a ball out of it without having to crinkle and crumple the paper. So therefore, a sphere is not a flat space-time geometry. But there are some shapes, including some toruses, which have these very complicated shapes. Like they have these nuanced bends in them, but they can be made from a single piece of paper, if you like. And thus they satisfy the criteria of what astronomers would call flat space-time geometry, which is really all we know to observe in the universe. So it could well be there's such a shape. And that would be interesting because it means if you travel far enough, you'd loop back around, come back around to your original location. But for the moment, we don't know. And I think the consensus view amongst most cosmologists, and I probably subscribe to this view as well, is that as far as we can tell, the universe is not only flat, but probably infinite, which is a really trippy thought when you first think about it. Like the universe just goes on forever in all directions. And to connect that back to what you said about where the Big Bang happened, in this picture, the Big Bang didn't happen anywhere. The Big Bang happened everywhere. So every single part of space was at infinite density. That's what we mean by the Big Bang condition. So just after the Big Bang was that the density of the universe was approaching infinite. And so that condition was true at all locations in the universe. And that I think a lot of people get confused about that. They do imagine there's like a singular point, like an explosion where it happens. But it's not that there was a singular location of an explosion. It's that everything, everywhere, what's that film? Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, or whatever it is that won the Oscars. It's like that. That happened everywhere, all at once. The universe just explodes in all directions, or space explodes in all directions. And so that's, to me, that seems the simplest explanation, actually, because it satisfies the cosmological principle. The cosmological principle says there's no particular special places in space and time. Like everything's uniform, essentially. There's no preferred direction. That's like a core tenet of relativity. It satisfies our observations of what we see of the universe, that it's very, very flat. And it also, and again, satisfies this principle of mediocrity, because there's just an infinite number of expanses out there that just go on in all directions. And we're just a very, very infinitesimally mundane portion of that entire vastness. So I like it, but it comes along with some philosophical questions when you think about infinities.
Yeah, I love the overlap of philosophy. Terence McKenna has a really interesting idea that time itself is speeding up, where if you were to measure time by the amount of events that happen within a domain of time, more and more events are happening within intervals of time. So like in the early universe, it would take 1 billion years for a rock to move. And then, 100 million years ago, it would take 10 million years for a butterfly to change its wings from yellow to blue. These changes happened on a genetic, genetics is what propagated the change. And now he's saying it's epigenetics, and we're moving into the machine age where things are just going to, AI is going to be able to make 20,000 years of advancement in one night. And at that point, it'll be moving so fast that everything will be happening at once. Time will be completely vertical in the singularity.
Yeah, I've not heard that idea before, but I guess I totally understand where it's coming from. And if you read like Ray Kurzweil and the Singularity and that kind of stuff, it certainly echoes a lot of that line of thinking. And it's true that certainly in a biological sense and a technological sense, you can see this trend that the amount of time it took to go from a single cell to a multicellular organism was like 3.5 billion years, pretty much, right? Absolutely immense amount of time of evolution to get going. But then the amount of time it took to go from multicellular life to a mammal is hardly anything. You're talking about like maybe a couple of 100 million years after that point. And then to go from a mammal to a hominid is like a few million years. And then from a hominid to a civilization, hundreds of thousands of years. And so those time intervals of like key events keep shrinking. The danger of that a little bit is who gets to choose what's a key event? Like, because I just made those up, but you could come up with a different list. And so it's not completely objective. It's just an opinion about what the key events are. And the other issue I take about it is completely different, is that the universe, leaving the Earth alone, I think the universe is telling us the complete opposite story. The universe is telling us that everything slows down over time. So the early universe was incredibly violent. And if you look at the history of the entire universe, going all the way back to the Big Bang, you have, I'm going to forget the numbers, but within 10 to the minus 20 seconds or something, you have the first subatomic particles forming. Then from 10 to the minus 20 to like 10 to the minus 10, you have like the first atomic protons and neutrons forming. And then as you go further and further, these intervals become a little bit longer each time before you start getting a little bit more complexity developed in the universe, until eventually, finally, you start having like the first stars forming after a few million years, the first galaxies after the first tens of millions of years. And then planets and like rocky planets would probably take billions of years to come around. So that timescale seems to stretch out. And then as you go forwards in time, even further into the future, things just keep slowing down. So we have the sun running out of hydrogen fuel in order of sort of 5 billion years or so. Then after that, you'll have all the red dwarfs run out of fuel in trillions of years' time. Then you'll have the black holes all evaporate on timescales of like 10 to the 20 years or something, astronomically huge. And then as you keep going forward, eventually you hit this heat death, and the intervals between these marked events, these marked periods, keep extending longer and longer and longer. until eventually when you reach this period what you think will happen, called the heat death. And the heat death is when basically nothing happens at all in the universe anymore. The entropy of the universe has basically approached a maximal value. And at that point, it doesn't even make sense to talk about time. And so we really think that time probably slows to a stop during the heat death, because there's no way to measure time anymore because everything is the same everywhere. And so I think a cosmologist and astronomer would think about it 180 from what Terence described. But I understand from a human and a technological and biological perspective, it seems that way. But the universe, I think, is actually doing the opposite.
I love how you think on these extremely zoomed out scales. And I just watched a video of yours, Outlasting the Universe. And I thought that was probably the most beautiful YouTube video I've ever watched. And it was all fiction. You kind of wrote that as a fantasy story. I'm wondering, are you going to get more into like fiction writing and sci-fi fantasy?
Yeah, I'd love to start writing maybe a book or something at some point. I think I am planning on writing a book next year. It'll probably be a non-fiction book though, and I'm sort of in talks with a publisher right now to work on that. I have a sabbatical coming up next year, so I thought that'd be a great time to finally have a break to actually do some writing. I like writing short stories. So I think Atlas in the Universe is a nice short story, and I've done a couple of those. There was one I did about the first civilization to ever. It's almost like the mirror of that Outlast in the Universe. Outlast in the Universe considers a civilization that's basically the last civilization left in the universe. Like, how do you extend yourself to infinity, to the heat death? Whereas the other one I did earlier about these Imans, I think the video is called The First Civilization, is almost a completely opposite tragedy, where you wake up first, but there's nobody to talk to, and you desperately want to have somebody to talk to. And what do you do with the realization that you are totally alone in the universe, and you're going to have to wait billions of years before anyone pops up, and you probably won't last that long. So how do you cope with that? So yeah, those are fun things to explore. I have a few other ideas like that I want to get into. And obviously one of my heroes, Carl Sagan, flirted with this quite a bit. I mean, we already mentioned the book Contact, which is one of my favorite books. And it's not so much that the writing is, there's much better writers, I would say. Carl Sagan's an excellent writer, but there's much better writers, I'd say, than Carl Sagan out there for fiction. But I think a scientist approaches these questions in a totally different way to you're used to, and you could see that there was like a depth behind the ideas. It wasn't, sometimes like you watch a show like Lost or something. It's just so infuriating, isn't it? Because you're thinking, there must be some explanation for why there's a polar bear here in the middle of, like, what's the explanation? And then you watch the whole show, just every time you're waiting for some resolution, and there's no resolution to anything. It's just like completely infuriating that the writing always seems very thin and just like this, like this short-termism. Like, how can we just, all I care about is making someone come to the next episode. And I think the best science fiction is totally the opposite. There's like a whole legendarium of deep thought and a whole universe that's been constructed behind the story that you're reading. And I always love, like I mentioned, I love Tolkien. I love that kind of work where you can go much deeper into the physics and the mechanics of that universe that you live in. So that's the kind of fiction I enjoy. And I don't know if I can live up to that kind of standard, but maybe I'll try my hand at it at one point.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you crafted your story around the science, around what will happen to the universe, rather than, other stories like a Lost would bend the science to fit their story, or, make the facts convenient to fit their story. I've heard you mention Tolkien quite a bit. I'm a big Tolkien fan. And when you were discussing it, we could increase our lifespan to 1,000 years, you made me instantly think of the elves. And I think Tolkien was very perceptive about, if you live a very long life, you will treat the world in a very different way, and you'll have a very different approach to like When you think of Tolkien's writing, like Rivendell, where the elves live, is this beautiful place that lasts forever, and the elves are like the custodians of the forest, whereas the opposite of the elves are the dwarves, who are just drilling and mining and kind of burning the world, and men as well. So it is like a good showcase of that psychology. Like if you are in this very long-term mindset, you're going to treat the environment in a very different way.
Yeah. I even think that there's really interesting cosmological ideas in that writing as well, because I think for me, the overriding theme of his work is the sense of decline. And that is like the nature of the universe itself is essentially a state of decline. Like it started out in this wonderful low entropy state, and it's inevitably going towards this higher and higher entropy inexorably. There's just nothing that can stop that from happening. And we can try and create pockets of a memory of maybe what it was like, and try and preserve our planet as hard as we can, or preserve an environment against the torments of time, in the same way what Rivendell is in Tolkien's work, right? It's preserved essentially by the power of one of those 3 elven rings that Elrond has. It's kind of preserving Rivendell, but as soon as the one ring is destroyed, the power of that ring dissipates, and so they can't maintain Rivendell anymore, and so Rivendell will just now finally succumb to the forces of decline. And yeah, I think it's a very tragic view. It's almost the total opposite of the way we normally think about progress. Like everything gets better and better and better over time, and so there's something really romantic and tragic about that writing, but also kind of an acceptance. And I think living forever also comes with its own downsides. And as you know, the elves are kind of pained in a way to live in Middle Earth forever, because they hate seeing the change. They hate seeing things be different from the way they were used to it. And the only escape for them is essentially to go to Valinor, which is like a heaven for them, and to escape the change of Middle Earth. We probably don't have that option in the same way, but I mean, people talk about a simulated universe in maybe in the same kind of breath, that we might eventually upload our minds into that kind of universe, which for us might be our Valinor, our version of an escape away from the decline of the world around us.
Or we could already be in that simulation. What are your thoughts on the simulation theory?
Yeah, I read, as with many of these topics, I did a video of this before, but I had been thinking about, and I read a paper about this before, and in that paper, I was pretty on the fence about it. And I tried to just apply the tools of Bayesian statistics to this problem. So Bayesian statistics is kind of a most objective way of evaluating hypotheses and weighing them against each other. And as far as I'm aware, no one had ever done that before. So I thought it would be an interesting exercise to do it. Of course, I learned from that, whenever you write about the simulation hypothesis, it gets way more press attention than you possibly expect. I really just thought of it as like a cute little paper. And suddenly I'm getting like loads of journalists interviewing me about this paper, which, is kind of insightful, but I didn't think it deserved the amount of attention that it got. But it's just like whenever you talk about this subject, people get interested. And really the math worked out that, there's basically 2 scenarios. One scenario is that simulation technology is basically impossible. It's not possible to ever simulate a reality that's so convincing you wouldn't be able to distinguish it, right? Because for me to be simulated right now, I'd have to not be able to tell that I was simulated. That technology is just, we talked about limits of technology. There may be a limit to technology that simply prevents that from happening. I just have to pause because my laptop's wants a battery plug-in. Just give me a second.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, we'll see if that holds charge. If it doesn't, then we'll stop again.
So it's impossible for the technology to get to a point where it's indistinguishable from reality.
So it may simply be, in this one scenario, it may simply be that it's not possible to ever build that technology. If we're in that scenario, then of course the probability that we are not simulated is 100%, because it's simply not possible. There is the other scenario that this technology is possible, in which case you have one reality sat right at the top, which is base reality, the true reality, and then you have a whole swarm of realities which are all simulated underneath that. So let's say there is n simulated realities and one true reality. So the probability that you would be in true reality would be 1 divided by n. Now that's the scenario that when you hear like Elon Musk talk about it, he often focuses on that. So he just says the probability we were simulated is, it's almost 100%. Or in other words, the probability we're not simulated is infinitesimal. It's 1 divided by n, and n could be very, very large. But that's only one scenario. So the thing I just really want to point out is that we don't know that scenario is possible. There's this other scenario. So when you take the two scenarios together, there's a 50% chance, I would say, just a priori, before you have any information, your most objective way we choose priors is to give everything even weight. So you'd say there's a 50% chance that we're in scenario A, where we're guaranteed not to be simulated, and there's a 50% chance we're in the scenario where we're almost certainly simulated. But there's a small chance we're not. And so when you add those two probabilities together, you basically have like 50% plus 0.0001%. It ends up being greater than 50%. So therefore, chances are it's slightly more likely that you would be not simulated overall than simulated. So that was my contribution, just to sort of work through the math and apply that prior. But that prior is the objective prior, what we'd call, but somebody might have a different prior. So you could have your own prior that's, well, no, it will definitely, I'm giving it a 90% chance that we're going to be simulated. And that's just up to you. Anyone can choose their own prior, but normally in objective Bayesian inference, you just apply even weights to everything. So I wrote a paper about that, but more recently I've been thinking about something I talked about in the video and talked about in my paper that I think is a really brilliant insight by Sean Carroll. Maybe some of your listeners know Sean Carroll. He has a podcast called Mindscape. He's also very well known on many TV shows and books. He wrote The Biggest Ideas in Physics is his current trilogy of books that he's writing. I think he's on book number 2. He's just come out on that trilogy. And Sean Carroll pointed out what I call Carroll's contradiction. He didn't call it that, but that's what I'm calling it. And he said, here's a strange thing about the simulation hypothesis. If simulations happen, then you have this hierarchy. You have realities that simulate realities, that simulate realities, that simulate realities. And every level of reality must necessarily have less computational capability than the previous layer above it, because it's just a subset of what came before. And so eventually, there must be a level where the computer being used to simulate it is simply not big enough to allow simulations within that simulated reality. So maybe in that world, the most sophisticated simulation you can do is like a Super Nintendo version of Donkey Kong or something, right? That's like you get the world's biggest supercomputer. It's like the size of the entire universe, and the most sophisticated simulation you can do is Mario Kart 2. Like that's the most sophisticated simulation you can do. So in that universe, they are essentially sterile. To think about like having, whether you can have children, they're infertile. They cannot themselves have daughter realities. So Sean Carroll pointed out that there should be many more realities of these daughter realities which are sat right at the bottom of this hierarchy, where they themselves lack the ability to simulate more realities. So I call this the sewer of reality, the level where you are infertile, you are sterile, you cannot yourselves produce daughter-children realities. And so because there's far more of them than any other type of reality, just because of the branching of each level, statistically, we are most likely to live in the sewer level of reality. If that's true, that we live in the sewer of reality, then we are incapable of ever making simulations ourselves. There's the contradiction. We cannot produce simulations ourselves, and yet we are assuming that simulations are possible. So there's a logical contradiction in place. And so Sean Carroll rightly points out this is kind of odd. So I've been thinking about that contradiction a lot recently, and again, how to sort of ingest it into the statistical framework that I was working on before. So I don't have a result just yet, but I've been in correspondence with Sean and been thinking about this a little bit. And I think it's one of the most nuanced and subtle points about a simulation argument that is not discussed enough. It's a really brilliant insight.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we're coming to a point in our culture where we're getting very confused about things that we thought we knew for sure in the past. Like suddenly flat Earth is like a very big thing now. And, I thought we had that one settled a couple hundred years ago, and, is reality.
Science still has that settled. I'm not too worried about it.
But yeah, thank you for beautifully explaining that. And I just really appreciate your way of teaching and communicating. And I want to say, if you ever have a script that you want animated, I'd be honored to do that.
Yeah, we've been talking about that for a little while. It'd be fun to do something like that. I just need to come up with the right idea.
Well, this sabbatical coming up might give you a little bit of time to, and I love the fiction stuff too.
Right. There you go.
I think your audience loved that fictional story. It was interesting to see how much they liked that style.
Yeah, I get great comments of that, and I certainly plan to do more. I think I'm trying to sprinkle them in, just to try and it's like one for me, one for them type thing. Like try and keep it.
Where do you want to take this? Where do you want to take Cool Worlds?
I mean, my passion is just research. I mean, that's always been my passion. So I just love being able to keep discovering the universe and learning about the universe. And when you're in love, you want to tell the world about it. And that's how it feels as a science communicator, is that I'm discovering these things, I'm learning about things, and I feel compelled to tell people about it. So as long as I have the ability to keep doing that, I'll be very satisfied in my career. And there isn't a firm, specific goal, like I want to be on Netflix or something like that. It's just, I just want to keep having the ability, whatever it is, whatever platform I'm on, to try and inspire people. And sometimes I get these wonderful letters or comments like the ones you generously offered today that just encourage me to keep going. And that at the end of the day, at one point in the past, I was a little kid who was inspired by things I was reading and learning about. And if you can pass that torch along, then I think you've done a good
beautiful
job.
I love that philosophy, and I hope you never stop creating these amazing videos and inspiring content. I'm also curious to know, like, how is the university how are they approaching you? Are they like encouraging you, or are you getting any backlash? Like, I know that they kind of can get a little tricky when a professor goes out on their own. What's been the response?
Generally very supportive. I mean, it's not a very controversial topic, right? Maybe if I was making videos as a Jewish professor about the Gaza-Israeli war, that could be like an extremely controversial thing that would almost certainly have the university wanting to like breathe down my neck on. But I make videos about pretty much the least controversial thing you can imagine, which is just the nature of the universe, just totally devoid of any kind of real conflict in terms of people getting upset about that. So the university is very supportive of everything I've done, and they've helped me set up this way that folks can actually donate to my team. So I should mention this as a little plug, if you don't mind, that if folks want to support my research team, the Cool Worlds Lab, it's not like Patreon. Patreon, the money you donate and it supports the creator directly. It's money goes into their pocket. I don't see this money. Actually, this money goes to the research lab. So it actually supports my students. It supports us, writing papers, going to conferences, publishing this work, buying the equipment to do the research, that kind of level of work. So actually, every penny goes towards actually making research happen. So if you want to do that, the best way is to head to my website, coolwordslab.com/support. coolwordslab.com/support, and that's kind of an innovative structure. I don't think any other research team I know of has this, where just general members of the public are donating like the price of a coffee per month, and that money is being used from hundreds, thousands of people coming together to help us discover the universe. I think it's a wonderful way of funding science, because it means I have to write less research proposals, because now that's normally how scientists get funded, is writing research proposals, which is a huge time sink. But instead of having to do that, I can spend more time making videos and doing podcasts and things like this, which then allows us to get more funding. And so there's kind of like a synergy, like the research leads to more funding, and that funding leads to more research, and it kind of cycles round and round, and we kind of skip or sidestep the usual politics of the whole proposal and time wastingness of that whole system. So I think it doesn't work for every field maybe, but it's kind of a wonderful experiment that we're playing. The university has supported that.
That's wonderful. And everybody check out Cool Worlds, support Cool Worlds, one of my favorite YouTube channels. And I'm very grateful for you, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. This was a pleasure.